Okay, so I'm not showing my face because I look a little rough today, but this is just a practice run of my portion of a group project I'm working on this quarter with some colleagues. And we are studying the Prison Abolition Movement as a social justice movement in America. Um, and so I have 3 slides, and so I'm just going to practice those 3 slides that I have. And those slides are about strengths and gaps and also about implications for social work practice. Okay. This social justice movement definitely brought forth a clear assessment of systemic injustice. There have been periods of intense research around the implications of incarceration, and that data is remarkably troubling. There is no doubt that this system is a great injustice, and those who experience it directly were driven to collectively speak out about those experiences and begin this movement toward prison abolition. The research has unraveled layers and layers of systemic injustice, exposing the really awful histories of this nation. We see that in documentaries such as 13th, a film uncovering some historical context around the 13th Amendment and policy in the U.S. at that time. It also illustrates the values that were held by society at the time these institutions were expanding, and how the U.S. government promoted white superiority and white supremacy through policy. These systems are continuously upheld through the creation of new policy, and they continue to impact Black, brown, and other marginalized communities. But this system is upheld in other ways too. Think about how the media narrative was and is still tailored to criminalizing and villainizing Black and brown communities. Think about the way the Central Park jogging case was displayed in the media, as well as current media narrative around BLM and police brutality. We see in real time how these visuals are shaping the way we view these things and the way we view criminality. These narratives promote the functioning of these systems and the increased rates of policing in communities of color through the creation of bias. And that works to benefit the system really well, because now we see microaggressions like store employees keeping watchful eyes on BIPOC in stores, or white women clutching their purses or locking their doors when they see Black men walking by. These are symptoms of those misconceptions, and white America has been conditioned to believe that these communities deserve punishment. That creates a big gap for this movement, because without the participation of white America and without active and conscious awareness from literally everybody in society, this movement will continue to hit barriers and the fight will be stretched out over more generations. But how do you continue to fight against a society that has layers and layers of armor to protect its infrastructure? So I think misconceptions of crime and justice are definitely a huge barrier for this movement, because there is so much fear present in the community that it results in almost a demand for law and order. But the thing is, the prison abolition movement is a direct response to that oppressive legislation, to the media narrative, and to the problematic policing. Leaders have proposed alternatives that are anti-oppressive and would benefit society by addressing and reducing crime, reducing recidivism, and creating space for transformative justice and healing within the community. These proposals would offer massive benefits to society, because people would have access to what they need to be well, such as access to health care, adequate employment, stable and affordable housing, and access to food and nutrition. When people have what they need, they thrive. But the government does not meet the basic needs of the people in this nation, and it is irresponsible to not understand how that intersects with crime. This movement is simply asking the U.S. government to hold themselves accountable for systemic injustices that have been imposed for hundreds of years, and show that they are taking accountability by implementing change using the foundational knowledge that now exists. Data shows that incarceration rates decrease and recidivism lowers when the system focuses on rehabilitation more than it focuses on punishment. Another gap is the limited use of evidence-based research within these systems. The courts typically don't consider factors such as trauma or mental health or substance use disorder or poverty and how that affects behavior when they are reviewing cases and sentencing people. The application of restorative or transformative justice practices are hardly ever used in these institutions. And the lack of that contributes to the issues of mass incarceration, especially when we think about the statistics regarding those incarcerated and how many people in these institutions simply needed access to some form of treatment or rehabilitation versus imprisonment. I am sharing some graphs from prison policy. One shows the incarceration rates in Washington state by race and ethnicity, while the other shows incarceration rates as a whole. The graph on the left has Washington state's rates in orange, with higher rates than most countries and nearly as much as the U.S. in its entirety, meaning Washington state incarcerates a lot of people. The graph on the left shows that BIPOC are largely represented in Washington state prisons, despite representing a small percentage of the entire population. I think that this is something to think about in regards to social work practice. As we've seen in the graphs, the number of people incarcerated in Washington state is staggering. We incarcerate more people in our state alone than most countries do. It is very likely we will engage in communities or with communities and individuals that have been or are currently being impacted by loss as a result of incarceration. So what does that mean for social work practice? What should we know as practitioners? First, we should understand the collateral consequences of incarceration and how to alleviate those consequences. As with any loss, grief can weigh heavily on those affected, as the removal of someone from the family unit is often abrupt and creates imbalance within the unit. We should know that incarceration does not just impact the individual. The implications of incarceration affect family members, friends, and the community as a whole. People reintegrating are restricted from being able to vote or from getting public assistance. They experience difficulty obtaining adequate housing and employment. Incarceration increases poverty rates. It isn't likely someone will be accepted into college without passing a background check. How do you successfully reintegrate when all of the odds are strategically stacked against you? Despite people serving time for their crime, the reality is that the punishment lasts long after release. Those are collateral consequences. And statistically speaking, more than half of those incarcerated suffer from a mental health disorder, with incarcerated women showing higher rates than incarcerated men. More than half of those incarcerated report having a substance use disorder or history with substance use. People who are incarcerated are 3 to 5 times more likely to meet criteria for psychological distress compared to the general population. Many were living in poverty, living with trauma, or treated like second-class citizens prior to incarceration. These are already huge barriers that exist, disrupting the ability to thrive. Imagine what it must feel like to live with mental health and substance use disorders and then essentially have everything else that gives you a sense of direction stripped from you when you are released from incarceration. The impact of being treated like nothing within these institutions only to be released and meet the same treatment from society is absolutely discouraging and further damages already marginalized communities. LGBTQ and Black and Brown populations have been historically oppressed and are also disproportionately represented in these institutions. As practitioners, understanding the historical context of these systems can be helpful as we facilitate healing within our communities and work to advocate against oppressive systems. This is an infrastructure that is in need of massive change. And an important value that we hold as social workers is to promote the overall well-being of society. And it's important for us to think about that in practice, especially when we're working with people who have been impacted by racist and colonial people, systems, and structures. We have to strive to be anti-racist and anti-colonial because not addressing those biases that we developed will create space for us to participate inadvertently in the oppression of the people we are meant to serve.